Ever since the Freddy Files Ultimate Guidebook came out shortly before Security Breach, a theory called StitchlineGames sparked, and since then it has grown a lot. A little over 2 years ago, I made a video explaining why I personally didn't believe it. The video was over 35 minutes long, and nowadays I don't agree with much of what I said, and actually I now believe the theory. For those who don't know, StitchlineGames is a theory that all the Fazbear Frights Stitch Wraith epilogues and all the stories that connect to them take place in the game's timeline. Because I now believe the theory, I want to go back to that video and explain why I think the evidence I used to disprove it no longer holds up. I have already explained in past videos like this one and this one why I believe the Stitch line is in the games, so I won't be doing that again, as you can just check out my previous videos. But like I said, in this video I'll be explaining away the evidence that I used in an attempt to disprove it. So without further ado, let's get started. Whenever I write a theory video, I always write down extensive notes about what I'll be talking about in the video in order before fully writing the script. I realized while doing those notes for this video that it's going to be a pretty big video, as the notes alone were about 5 pages long. So let's just jump into the evidence, starting with Into the Pit. How this will work is I'll go over each point against StitchlineGames and individually go over each counterpoint right afterwards. One of the key points about Into the Pit that I used to constantly point out is the fact that when Spring Bonnie kills the missing kids, patrons at the restaurant are noticeably panicking, running away and screaming and trying to protect their children. However, in the games, the kids simply went missing, so Into the Pit implying that people actually found the bodies doesn't actually make sense. However, in reality, people don't have to have seen the bodies at all. In 2023, I made a video on a short story which was all about the missing children incident and how it went down, in which I came up with a way the screaming and running would work. In the graphic novel adaptation of Into the Pit, a man is seen yelling for his child, Susie, asking where she is amidst all the running and screaming. It's entirely possible that this is actually what caused the running and screaming. The parent of a missing child was essentially causing a panic because their child was now missing. So, parents began to run away in fear of the same happening to their own children. However, there is another option, but first I'll go over a couple other things. The story claims there are half a dozen children killed by Spring Bonnie, which means 6, when in the missing children incident in the games, there's actually only 5. These kids are also lined up against the wall, but in the games, we know Afton is the one who stuffs the kids, but he does so as he kills them. To be specific, the children weren't killed then stuffed, they actually died inside the animatronics, which is known from the Silver Eyes trilogy and the FNAF 1 phone call. The bodies are never collectively dead outside the animatronics, so this doesn't make sense. Now, I still agree with this point, but while I used to disapprove of the explanation for this, I now think it actually does make sense. We learn in the 8th epilogue that the ball pit is not time travel at all. Instead, it stores memories and agony, so when you go into it, you basically live the memory of the missing children incident rather than actually living in that time. But this memory is warped in order to adjust for your presence. Oswald showing up changes a lot of what happens and even relies on his thoughts somehow. His friends refer to him as Oswald, even though that definitely isn't the name of whoever's memory this is. He gets upset about not having his own tokens to play arcade games, and then suddenly they appear in his pockets. In the game, you can literally take items from the pit and out into the real world. An example of agony manifestations, which are a thing as I'll discuss a tiny bit more towards the end of the video, and you can also take items from the real world into the pit and use them there, showing that the memory is not a literal representation of what happens. Every time you remember something, you're technically recreating the memory, so it's possible that this is just a twisted and very inaccurate memory of the missing children incident, not an accurate one. As for why there would be a 6th victim in the first place, my most recent theory was all about Shatter Victim, the theory that the bite victim's memories are broken apart and distributed among the missing kids, so he is tied to them. With this in mind, it's possible that the bite victim is the 6th kid in this story. Obviously he's not a missing child, but there's only 5 in the first place, so whoever this kid has to be is someone who isn't a missing child, and the bite victim kind of makes sense based on his connections to the missing kids. Or it could be someone else, as I talked about in my video on Return to the Pit. Another piece of evidence against Into the Pit being in the games is the fact that the missing children incident was stated in FNAF 1 to have happened on June 26th, yet the movie Back to the Future is mentioned repeatedly in the story, before the incident even happened, despite the movie coming out in July of 1985. What I found funny though was the fact that I never really believed this to be the greatest piece of evidence, as it could easily be an error or just meant to allude to the fact that the story is about supposed time travel and takes place in the same year Back to the Future released. Plus, Scott could have just not known the Back to the Future release date, or he could have wanted to reference it, but the missing children incident's date had already been established, and so it's another victim of the warped memory idea. That works fine. But what was funny was, despite me not thinking it was the greatest evidence in the world and kind of just using it as a side note, it was like the main piece of evidence people criticized, which was kind of funny. Another Fright story, I believe to disprove StitchlineGames, is Youre the Band. Although a scrapped story, the villain in Youre the Band is the Shadow, which is Eleanor in the Stitch line, and in the final Fright's epilogue, there is a part where Larson ends up in a bedroom that lines up pretty well with Timmy's bedroom from the story. In the story, Timmy, possessed by Gabriel, claims that the missing children's bodies were found, and apparently they were found lined up against the wall. In the games, the missing children were only found by Fazbear Entertainment at some point between the missing children incident and the opening of FNAF 2. They were found inside the animatronics, not against a wall, and so this doesn't add up. What's more is that this story takes place in 2015, 30 years after the missing children incident had gotten Freddy shut down years ago and it never opened again, contradicting both FNAF 1 and 2. On top of that, by 2015, the original animatronics had already been destroyed and put into the fun times, and so not only is it problematic that the animatronics are on stage and intact, but also that Freddy's head is still possessed by the spirit of Gabriel, as it definitely shouldn't be. Mike, a security guard working at the abandoned Freddy's and who knows about the paranormal stuff, appears in the story, clearly meant to be Michael Afton. However, he is said to look like a college student, when in reality, he would be between the ages of 45 and 50. Even if Remnant could make him look younger, the animatronics aren't destroyed, which means sister location hasn't happened yet, and so he should not be looking this young. All of this would be very good evidence if it weren't for the fact that Youre the Band is just not a part of the Stitch line. I think it definitely was originally supposed to be, considering the connections, but it literally cannot be for one simple reason. In the Fright's epilogues, it is stated that after Freddy shut down, it was bought by many different companies and turned into many different restaurants over the decades, ending with Jeff's Pizza. However, in Youre the Band, it is still an abandoned Freddy's, and we know this is the location of the original Missing Children incident, just like Into the Pits location, meaning these stories do not align and cannot be in the same continuity. This begs another question though. We know that the FNAF 1 location and the first Freddy's location are the same building, since FNAF 1 has a safe room, even though the safe rooms were discontinued in that first Freddy's location. However, if Freddy's was bought out after the Missing Children incident, how did Fazbear reacquire it for FNAF 1? However, it's entirely possible that the first Freddy's building was still owned by Fazbear Entertainment for the 10 or so years after the Missing Children incident, up until when Afton got spring-locked and sealed up. Then it started getting bought and transformed. If that isn't the case, it's also possible Fazbear just bought the building back, and since the building is smaller than FNAF 2's location, it still fits under a smaller budget as the FNAF 2 newspapers claim the next location would be. The next thing to talk about is The Man in Room 1280, the story that is all about William Afton, Ultimate Custom Night, Andrew, and setup and context for the rest of the Fright stories and epilogues. In the story, Afton is on life support, and the nurses claim he has been for many years, something I'll discuss further later on. Afton's body is just a burned corpse that looks nothing like a human other than his 2 arms, 2 legs, torso, and head. However, Afton in FNAF 6, which this story takes place right after, is actually missing an arm. One argument to deflect this is that Remnant can regenerate you, but if it did regenerate his arm, it would make more sense if it regenerated the rest of him too, and so he wouldn't even look like this in the first place. However, that's not really how that works. First of all, technically, while missing the majority of his left arm, he does still have a piece of it, so Arthur could have just simply been referring to that. But if that's not the case, the Remnant argument does kinda work. Think about it, both Andrew and Eleanor are inside Afton's body, both producing Remnant, which can definitely regenerate parts of him. By no means does it have to regenerate all of him though, and we know that because of Scraptrap himself. Inside Springtrap, Afton has barely any flesh left, yet when he's Scraptrap later on, he has much more. Sure, it looks different and Afton's body is a bit inconsistent, but there's no denying that Afton's corpse is much more intact in Scraptrap than in Springtrap. The different suit makes it clear that Afton went somewhere to repair himself after Sister Location, so it's possible he managed to find a new suit as well as Remnant, possibly in Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, which would explain his presence in the Entered Vent Repair minigame as I discussed in videos before. It's also possible that Andrew and or Cassidy is already attached to him and inadvertently regenerates him, or it could be intentional to ensure he doesn't die and his pain doesn't stop. The point is that Scraptrap has more bone and flesh on him, meaning Remnant did regenerate parts of him, but not all of him. So, after the fire, maybe Andrew did the same thing, regenerating some parts of him to ensure he still doesn't die so he can keep torturing him. So, that solves that problem. Another problem, the nurses point out how inside Afton's head are two brainwaves fighting for control. Some people have argued that these two brainwaves are Andrew and Cassidy, both fighting for control in torturing Afton. However, this is not the case. One of the brainwaves objectively has to be Afton, otherwise he is literally not in his own body and therefore not being tortured at all. However, we know that in the games, Cassidy is within Ultimate Custom Night. The final cutscene shows Golden Freddy disappearing off into the darkness. The Old Man Consequences minigame shows a Golden Freddy silhouette talking to Old Man Consequences, who tells him to leave the demon to his demons and rest, before Golden Freddy goes into the lake, implying going back to torturing Afton. But is this really the case? See, I think Cassidy is vengeful at first, but I don't think she's actually responsible for Ultimate Custom Night. I think when Old Man Consequences says leave the demon to his demons, what he is really saying is leave Andrew to torture Afton, rest and stop trying to save Andrew. If the princess in Princess Quest really is Cassidy, which I believe she is, the entire game is her trying to save Vanessa. In the logbook, Cassidy is trying to help the bite victim remember stuff. Cassidy is a helpful spirit. She wasn't torturing Afton alongside Andrew, she was really trying to get him to stop. Think about it, why is Golden Freddy disappearing off into the darkness? It's simple, Cassidy is trying to get Andrew to stop. She's not successful. Andrew continues torturing Afton, so Cassidy talks to Old Man Consequences, who tells Cassidy to leave Andrew to torture Afton and just rest her own soul. Going into the lake leads directly into the cutscene of Golden Freddy disappearing off into the darkness. She literally leaves Ultimate Custom Night. Yes, she was there for a time, but she leaves before the events of the Man in Room 1280, leaving only two brainwaves there at that time. An argument can be made that the nurses surely would have mentioned that while there are two brainwaves now, there used to be three, but Ultimate Custom Night isn't really a linear game. That Golden Freddy cutscene doesn't just end the game. Therefore, Cassidy could have just left really early, like even before Afton ended up in the hospital, and when he was still just underneath the pizza place. But this also kind of leads into another counterpoint. A scene in Princess Quest reflects the Old Man Consequences cutscene from Ultimate Custom Night, with Old Man Consequences telling Golden Freddy and Cassidy respectively to rest, indicating that Golden Freddy character in Ultimate Custom Night absolutely is Cassidy. But some people believe that Andrew is Golden Freddy. But is that really the case? Most people believe Andrew to be Golden Freddy because of that scene of Golden Freddy disappearing into the darkness, which people take to mean that Golden Freddy is responsible for Ultimate Custom Night. And if Andrew is the one you should not have killed, he should by extension be Golden Freddy. Plus, in the new kid, there is a child with curly black hair like Andrew's who was found inside the Golden Freddy suit. In the Fourth Fright's epilogue, Andrew stated that he didn't have anyone to talk to previously, and if he was Golden Freddy, he would definitely have had Cassidy and possibly even the bite victim. However, what this fails to realize is that the Freddys location in the new kid is not the MCI location. This is a random Freddys location in the forest, while the MCI location was turned into numerous other locations afterwards. So either Andrew isn't the kid in Golden Freddy there, or that Golden Freddy animatronic is not the same one that Cassidy possesses, or more likely, both. But this causes more problems, because we know that Cassidy absolutely is Golden Freddy, and Scott confirmed that there was a scrapped game-accurate movie screenplay all about Cassidy, meaning she is undoubtedly a very important character. So, if Andrew is the one you should not have killed, and Cassidy isn't, what exactly does she do? Well, despite her not being the vengeful spirit in Ultimate Custom Night, she does do a lot of important things throughout the story, including the story of Ultimate Custom Night on its own. She was a missing child who was stuffed into Golden Freddy, a spring-lock suit, meaning she was probably spring-locked, so she was likely the spirit that went through the most agony in her death. So she probably was, at one point, a vengeful spirit, likely being the one to keep Afton alive when he gets spring-locked, so that not only does he have to go through what he put her through, but also he cannot die and get the relief of the pain ending. It just lasts forever. Just because she is vengeful though, doesn't mean she is the vengeful spirit. I think she likely started out as vengeful, but Old Man Consequences got her to come to her senses, and so she goes out to try and help Andrew come to his senses, but can't. Cassidy, while vengeful at first, is generally one of the more caring spirits in the series. I talked in a previous video about how I think that Cassidy may be the player of FNAF World, trying to help Charlotte put the pieces of the bite victim back together. In the logbook, she also goes through trouble to try and help the bite victim remember his past, asking him questions about his past to try and get him to remember it. Not to mention, she is probably the princess in Princess Quest trying to save Vanessa. So yeah, she is an important character regardless, and her not being the one you should not have killed doesn't change that. Now, let's talk about the puppet a little bit. The puppet was in Lefty in FNAF 6, burning in the fire, and the police retrieved it and it was stored in an evidence locker. Larson takes it out of the evidence locker and then it ends up in the Afton amalgamation, then ends up at the bottom of a lake with the rest of the amalgamation. Then, in Security Breach, we find the blob, which has the puppet mask in it. We know this is the original puppet mask for a few reasons. First, while Lefty was originally supposed to be in FNAF AR, he was never actually added. The puppet was also made by Henry to protect Charlotte, meaning there was likely only ever one of them created. We also see in the security puppet minigame from FNAF 6 that the puppet did not have tears before getting possessed by Charlotte, and now that Happiest Day has happened after FNAF 6, the tears are gone in the blob. But what's the point? The puppet is in FNAF 6, then goes into the Afton amalgamation, and ends up at the bottom of a lake, and then somehow ends up back under FNAF 6 again? Isn't it simpler to just have the puppet stay under FNAF 6 the whole time? And how did it even get back under FNAF 6 and why? Well, we know Fazbear Entertainment covers its tracks, so they could have just easily gone out of their way to retrieve that stuff from the lake. But why is it under FNAF 6? Well, if you look at the model of the blob, you can find the left arm of Bonnie. And another left arm from Bonnie. And another left arm from Bonnie. There are 3 Bonnie left arms, meaning this is not the original Bonnie. There are at least 3 different Bonnie animatronics with parts in the blob, meaning these are actually animatronics from the FNAF AR Funtime service. The same would probably go for the Chica and Mangle in there too. What this implies is that the FNAF 6 location was just turned into Fazbear's company-wide dump. It's where the puppet, FNAF AR animatronics, and the rest of the Afton amalgamation was left behind. We only see what's on the outside of the blob, but there could easily be more parts of the Afton amalgamation as well as the workers and teens from the Tales epilogues tangled within its wire tentacles. Speaking of underneath FNAF 6, Freddy says during the burn trap ending that Vanny used him to dig down underneath the building. The hole that we go down that Freddy dug out does not exist yet in the epilogues. If that hole didn't exist yet, how did Afton's body get out from underneath the pizza place in order to get to the hospital? And how does the puppet get to the evidence locker? Also, what exactly is Vanny digging down to if she isn't trying to find Afton's dead body? Well, since we know now about the Mimic, it seems clear that Vanessa was actually down there for him, and Freddy had to clear a path so that Vanessa could make a base of operations for herself to turn the Mimic into Burn Trap and set him up in the recharge station. The FNAF 6 location is also pretty big as seen in the epilogues, so it's not super far-fetched to assume that there is another way down that the police investigating the fire could find to retrieve Afton and the puppet. Also, the hole doesn't lead down into the intertwining vents from FNAF 6, so if that's what Vanny was looking for with that hole, she wouldn't have found it anyway. Another story, Hide and Seek, is a story that takes place in modern day, during the Stitch Wraith era, and yet Shadow Bonnie is created in this story despite him existing by 1987 at the very latest. I have to admit though that this was definitely a very moot point, as Shadow Bonnie was not created in Hide and Seek. Shadow Bonnie in the story is simply Eleanor attaching onto Toby whose agony fueled her. However, this nicely segues into the next point. How are there Freddy's locations in the modern timeline when the only modern Freddy's location that we know of was FNAF 6, which was only made by Henry and then burned down? However, just because we only knew of one Freddy's existing, doesn't mean there actually only was one Freddy's location. Not knowing any examples of something doesn't mean it's not true. Since I made that video, we actually got evidence that there were Freddy's locations in the modern timeline outside of just the Pizzaplexes in FNAF 6. The story The Monty Within in Tales from the Pizzaplex talked about how Kane and Sienna went on their first date to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza a year ago. It has since closed down, but this was also probably not the FNAF 6 location. Technically it could be, but I find it unlikely. The point is that FNAF 6 wasn't the end-all be-all for Fazbear Entertainment, so other Freddy's locations opening after FNAF 6 isn't illogical. Plus, whether the Stitch line is in the games or not, FNAF 6 does happen in the books, so these stories take place after FNAF 6, and Freddy's locations are open, meaning even if Tales wasn't in the games, which it is, but even if it wasn't, it is able to work in the games regardless because it works in Tales, which matches with the timeline of the games. games. It's likely that after FNAF 6 and before the Pizzaplex opened, Fazbear Entertainment had a resurgence, opening up new Freddys locations in the modern day, making money, and eventually making the Pizzaplex. There's also another restaurant open in the Stitch line, that being Circus Baby's Pizza World in Dance With Me. That restaurant is open for much more than just a day, meaning it isn't the pizza world that Elizabeth died at. However, this doesn't really contradict anything, as it's entirely possible that this is just a completely different pizza world. That's just about everything that I talked about in my old video trying to disprove StitchlineGames. However, there's more evidence that other people have used and that I used in other videos outside of just my big one. So let's talk about those next. First of all, Count the Ways. In Count the Ways, Millie's grandpa is a collector and has a Funtime Freddy animatronic in his garage. He's even equipped with all the parts for him to kill people inside his stomach cavity. But Funtime Freddy in the games is in Circus Baby's Entertainment and rental at first, then becomes Ennard, and then by the time of this story, he is burned in the FNAF 6 fire. He cannot be here. However, this assumes that the Funtime Freddy in Count the Ways is even the one from the games. There's two options for what this animatronic is. First of all, Circus Baby's Pizza World, as I just said, exists in Dance With Me, probably with Funtime Freddy. Although those animatronics weren't built by Afton, they could very well have followed Afton's original blueprints whether they understood them or not, or the person running Fazbear Entertainment by this point could just also be evil. If the restaurant shut down after that, maybe the animatronics were discarded, with Funtime Freddy thrown into a junkyard for Millie's grandfather to find. However, I think there's a much simpler answer. This Funtime Freddy is not an actual Funtime Freddy. It's not even real. It's just a manifestation of agony, like Into the Pit Spring Bonnie. Keep in mind, Count the Ways is all Eleanor's doing, which we know because Millie is in the ball pit as one of Eleanor's victims. This Funtime Freddy is in no way an actual Funtime Freddy animatronic, at least not the one from the games. We know that for a fact, so it's entirely possible that it's just not actually a real animatronic in the first place. Into the Pit Spring Bonnie isn't an actual Spring Bonnie animatronic, it's just an agony manifestation that Eleanor created, one that acts in a similar way to the original Spring Bonnie, Afton. Ballora in Dance With Me isn't an actual Ballora animatronic, it's just an agony manifestation that Eleanor created of one that acts in a similar way to Ballora. So yeah, Count the Ways doesn't really matter, because that Funtime Freddy probably isn't actually real. In Frailty, the main character Jessica is a victim of Eleanor, still using the pendant. However, Eleanor is dead already by the end of the Stitch line, so how does Jessica have this right now? Well, I don't think this is a huge deal, as I don't think there's a very big timeline jump between the end of the Stitch line and Frailty. Plus, Eleanor doesn't technically die, she's just made purely of agony, and that agony is trapped within a memory at the end. She doesn't die. Technically, it's entirely possible that at some point the agony can escape that memory. The story Lally's Game is based around a chest, and at the end of the story, the chest is in a dark attic, an area the owners of the house use for memorabilia, and two white eyes peer over the chest. In the final epilogue, Eleanor is found inside a chest which is in a dark room that people would probably store memorabilia in. Obviously, Lally's Game would happen after this epilogue, so technically this would just somehow be a premonition, but the point is that Lally's Game is likely Eleanor's doing. So even if Frailty was many years after the Stitch line, which it probably wasn't, Eleanor could very well have still given Jessica the pendant, as she probably eventually comes back regardless. Another thing some people find problematic about the Stitch line being in the games is the nature of the restaurants Freddy's becomes. The first Freddys location, the same building as FNAF 1, became numerous different restaurants after it shut down. By the time of FNAF 3, it is probably Jeff's Pizza, but the crew went back to those old Freddys locations and retrieved a bunch of parts, including Springtrap, who would have been there for years. Surely some of the owners of the restaurants would have either found him or heard him groaning, but nope. So how does the FNAF 3 crew get the loot if the building is Jeff's now, and how does no one find Springtrap before that crew does? Well, Springtrap is pretty easy to explain. The safe room had been completely sealed by then, essentially becoming a wall and likely being soundproof, which is how no one would have found him or even heard him. The only reason he was found in the first place is because Phone Dude had found out that there was an extra room boarded up, probably from the building's blueprints or from someone who worked at Freddy's years ago. But how does the FNAF 3 crew get stuff if the building is Jeff's now? Well, the Felix the Shark story The Scoop actually explains this. In the story, there's a restaurant called Sideshow Snack Shack which shuts down, and then the building building gets rebranded as a movie theater. However, even though it isn't the snack shack anymore, there is a storage room that has all the stuff from it in it. It's entirely possible that the restaurants Freddy's turned into also still had a room like this, containing all the stuff from Freddy's. So when the FNAF 3 crew shows up for Freddy's loot, they likely get a lot of it from there. Also, in the Into the Pit game, there's a dump near Jeff's where the stuff from the FNAF 6 fire is, so it's possible some of the stuff from Freddy's was also in the dump and collected by the FNAF 3 crew. But I think the biggest thing that people criticize StitchlineGames for is just the timing. There's not enough time for everything to happen. In the Man in Room 1280, the nurses claim that Afton has been in the hospital for many years, meaning FNAF 6 took place many years ago. At the end of that story, Andrew lets Afton go and infects everything, setting all the events of the epilogues and the rest of Frights in motion, including the story Fetch. In that story, there's a kid named Jake, who is 4 years old, and Jake in the real Jake is 9. The epilogues happen later on in the same year as the real Jake, since Margie in the story had lived in that house for 3 years, and in the second epilogue she had still only been living there 3 years. However, before we keep going, I want to just say that this piece of evidence doesn't really matter, as there's not really any indication that the two Jakes are the same. Not to mention Fetch and the real Jake happen in 2 completely different parts of the country. More about Fetch though, the Freddy's location in the story had been abandoned for many years, and Fetch, infected by Andrew, was in that Freddy's location, meaning he was delivered here from the distribution center, and it doesn't make sense for him to be delivered to an abandoned Freddy's location. The Man in Room 1280 is years after FNAF 6, and Fetch is years after the Man in Room 1280. Many years in both cases. This is extremely problematic though. See, if Tails is also in the games, which it probably is, not only because of Help 1&2's update and Secret of the Mimics trailer, but also, especially, if the Stitchline is, since Frailty and Lally's game seem to connect the two. And in that case, it has to be acknowledged that the Mimic takes place in 1979, and the Storyteller is supposedly 40 years later in 2019. The Pizzaplex supposedly opens in 2019. That means FNAF 3 has to be in 2015 rather than 2023. The Stitch Wraith in the epilogues is stated to have been seen near the fire site, which is the burned down FNAF 6 location, meaning the Pizzaplex hasn't been built yet. That means the entire Stitch line has to have happened in the span of 4 years max, and that's also assuming FNAF 6 and FNAF 3 are in the same year, which may not even be the case. There's not enough time for Afton to be in the hospital for years, Fetch to be then shipped off to Freddy's, that location shut down, years to pass, have the Fetch story happen, and then the epilogues all happen before the Pizzaplex even opens. All that would not fit within 4 years. Or at least, I don't think it could. And neither did a lot of people. But now I think it actually works fine, but because I don't think there's actually a time skip. If we actually look at what the nurses say in the Man in Room 1280, it actually makes much more sense if they are lying to Arthur. They claim that they believe this man is pure evil, and if they truly believed that, why would they take so many years to call Arthur? It's very probable that they actually just didn't wait. Maybe Afton was only here for like a few weeks or months at most. You may be thinking that the nurses straight up say he's been here for many years. And that is true, but if you think about the context, it kinda implies that they are lying. They say the man has been on life support for many years, and Arthur asks, how many years? To which they claim it is irrelevant, which doesn't make sense if they are telling the truth. Sure, it doesn't matter that much how many years, but what's the problem with still just saying how many years, unless it hasn't actually been years, and they're actually just trying to get rid of the thing that they believe is pure evil as soon as they possibly can. It's also revealed in the story that a billionaire had bought the hospital about 10 years ago, and I once said that it only makes sense that he would do that if it was because of the strange man in Room 1280. However, that's kind of a baseless assumption, so it doesn't really matter. So yeah, the Man in Room 1280 is likely months or maybe even just weeks after FNAF 6, not years. That solves that problem. But what about Fetch? Well, it is stated in the story that the Freddy's location wasn't just shut down, it was actually completely abandoned. Something had supposedly happened at another Freddy's location that had caused all of them to shut down all at once. That makes it very clear that this location closed in the 80s when the missing children incident happened, decades before FNAF 6 and the Man in Room 1280, meaning Fetch actually was brought to this location after it was abandoned, no matter what. Given Eleanor's control over so many random things like novelty glasses and circus babies or Funtime Freddy and Count the Ways, it's entirely possible that she deliberately caused Fetch to be sent sent to the abandoned Freddy's in order to lure someone in, that person being Greg, who claimed he just strangely felt drawn to the location. So that resolves the timing issue entirely, and so it's entirely possible for all the Stitch Wraith stingers to just happen in a year or two following FNAF 6. Almost. There's just one other problem with the timing, and it's the problem I have the biggest issue explaining away. In the 5th Fazbear Frights epilogue, the FNAF 6 fire is stated to have been so far in the past it was almost ancient history in the department. So how does that work if the Pizzaplex opens in 2019, placing the Stitch Wraith stingers in at the latest 2018, because the Pizzaplex is built by the end of the year before it actually opens? So I'll be honest, it's kind of hard to explain, because I don't really have a completely sound answer, but at the same time, are the years of the timeline really that consistent? Because with these books, there seems to be issues no matter what way you look at it, and I feel like that should probably have to wait for like its own theory video where I tackle the topic of the FNAF timeline and its consistency once again, because I've done that before. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. Let me know in the comments what you think of this theory, and stay tuned for that video on the FNAF timeline's consistency. I'll see you all then, and yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Bye guys!